I got a call from my younger sister, Lois, who hadn't replied to any of my messages before. It came just before our mother's funeral. She said she had just returned from Hawaii with her husband, Keith, and brought me chocolate souvenirs. I was so angry at her thoughtlessness that I lost control and shouted at her in front of the whole family. I told her she could have my husband, but she needed to get to the funeral already. Lois was shocked and asked, "What?" On the phone. I gave her the funeral home address and hung up, knowing she'd try calling again. I turned off my phone, set her down in the family section, and tried to calm myself. My name is Emily, and I just turned 38. I grew up with my parents and my sister, who's 6 years younger than me. My parents were strict with me, the eldest, but they spoiled Lois because of her pretty looks. Whenever Lois wanted something, she'd smile and ask me for it, and I would almost always give in. This carried on even after she grew up and became a very troublesome sister. My father passed away 8 years ago from an illness, and my mother was diagnosed with a terminal illness 6 months ago. She was in and out of the hospital. I married Keith, a senior colleague from work, 2 years ago and moved into an apartment near my office. For the past 6 months, I've been driving an hour each way to care for our mother while working. Lois had moved back home and quit her job after breaking up with her boyfriend a year ago, but she kept insisting I was better at caregiving and pushed the responsibility onto me. So, I took a month off work to care for her, but despite my best efforts, she passed away 2 days ago. Where was Lois during all of this? She had flown off to Hawaii a week earlier. I tried to convince her not to go, but she didn't listen and went anyway. At the funeral, after the priest finished speaking, family and friends began to pay their respects. It was clear that my mother had been kind-hearted because not only family, but many of her friends also came to mourn. Some colleagues from my company showed up too. One of them said, "I'm sorry for your loss," and I thanked them, telling them I was grateful my father-in-law, the company president, had allowed me to take time off to be with my mother during her final moments. He's been so understanding and helpful. But where was Keith? I hadn't seen him there. I explained to a colleague, he's been overseas on a business trip since last week, and I haven't been able to reach him. They replied, "I'll ask the sales manager about it. Keith and I work in different departments, and he's always complaining about his busy business trips." I tried to accept that Keith wasn't here during this hard time, but I couldn't help feeling anxious about handling everything on my own, especially since I couldn't contact him or Lois. My father-in-law, though, took time out of his busy schedule to attend the funeral, and his support almost brought me to tears. I felt so thankful for him. On the way to the crematory in the limo with the rest of the family, I turned my phone back on, hoping Keith might have tried to reach me. To my surprise, there were almost 30 voicemails, most of them from Lois. In one message, she yelled at me, "Answer your phone. You can't just make up ridiculous lies because you're upset that I took Keith from you." It hit me that she was talking about Keith. When she called before the funeral, I had been too busy dealing with the mourners to fully understand what she was saying. Lois and Keith are having an affair. No, that can't be true. I was shocked and immediately felt upset. Did that mean Keith was on a trip with Lois in Hawaii, right when my mother was passing away? In a panic, I checked the voicemails. There were several from my husband, Keith. In one, he said, "I'm so sorry, but you're a strong woman. You can survive on your own. But Lois, I need to support her, so let's break up." Hearing this, I felt like I was in a soap opera. I muttered to myself, I wish I hadn't heard that. I couldn't believe it. I had just found out that my husband and my sister were having an affair and enjoying themselves in Hawaii during my mother's funeral. I quickly called Lois and told her, "You need to come now if you want to say goodbye to Mom. We're already heading to the crematory." Lois responded sarcastically, "That's not funny. Stop lying. You're just bitter because I took Keith from you." But I told her it was the truth. "You must be upset about losing your husband, right? He's the next company president and rich." Lois tried to justify it, saying, "There are good lies and bad lies. You're an adult. You should know better." I was stunned. I never thought I'd hear that from her. I never knew you and Keith had been cheating, I said, feeling frustrated. Lois sounded happy, like she always did when she tricked me as a kid. I sighed and said, anyway, this isn't the time. If you want to say goodbye to Mom, come now. But then, I heard Lois talking to someone else, probably Keith's father. It seemed like they didn't expect me to bring up his father. Keith, who was apparently right next to Lois, took the phone and asked Emily, is that true? I told him, if you don't believe me, do whatever you want. I'm hanging up now. After that, we arrived at the crematory. It was my last chance to say goodbye to my mom. But my mind was a mess. The rush of these past few days and the grief of losing my mother left me feeling lost. Tears streamed down my face. One of my relatives saw me and patted my back, saying, your mom would surely be grateful to you, Emily. I stood in front of my mother's casket and said my final goodbye. Mom, thank you for everything. I'm going to miss you so much. Just as her casket was being carried out for cremation, there was a commotion. Lois and Keith rushed in. Lois saw the casket disappearing behind the doors and tried to grab it, crying out, wait, I haven't said goodbye to Mom yet. But the doors shut firmly in front of her. She wailed, no, this can't be happening. Keith stood behind her, looking shocked. It's time to move on, I said, trying to calm the situation. This is upsetting the others. Lois turned to me, furious. Why didn't you tell me, Emily? I couldn't even say goodbye to Mom. This is your fault. My fault? I asked, stunned. Yes, if Mom was doing so poorly, you should have told me sooner. You never said anything, she yelled. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had explained Mom's condition to Lois so many times. Every time, she brushed it off, saying, I don't know how to handle this. You take care of it, Emily. Keith chimed in. She's right. You should have made it clearer how serious it was. This is on you. I stared at them, furious. What were you two doing all this time? I shouted. They both frowned, finally silent. If you won't say it, I will. I continued. You were having a fun, romantic trip to Hawaii, weren't you? The relatives, who had been quietly watching, started whispering among themselves. They must have been puzzled by Lois and Keith's absence. During such an important time, I had been covering for them, making excuses whenever anyone asked why Lois or Keith wasn't around. I glanced at the closed doors where my mom's casket had disappeared and apologized silently in my heart. Mom, I'm sorry. I wanted to say goodbye more peacefully. But I knew I couldn't let this flight. Stealing myself, I asked, when did this affair even start? You both knew I was on leave, taking care of Mom. How could you do this? I was struggling so much, and I asked for help so many times, I said, my voice shaking. But all you two did was enjoy yourselves, didn't you? Lois snapped, enough. This is all your fault, Emily. You didn't keep Keith close enough. I blinked, confused. What's that supposed to mean? You should have prioritized your husband more, she said. Keith told me he was bored at home because all you ever talked about was work and taking care of Mom. Poor Keith. I turned to Keith, glaring. He avoided my eyes, looking down at the floor. Lois smirked. You married a rich, future company president, and it made you conceited. That's why he came to me. You always act like this, Emily. Her words stung, but they weren't unfamiliar. In the past, whenever I had a boyfriend, Lois always managed to take them from me. The only exception was Keith because back then, she was already living with someone else. What a shame, she continued. From now on, I'll be with Keith. I'll be the future president's wife, so you should just break up with him. Fine, I said, my voice steady. You can't have Keith. I'll divorce him. At the moment, I felt nothing. When I had married Keith, I didn't even know he was the president's son. Back then, he was just a kind and bright man who worked at a regional branch before transferring to my department. He was friendly, hardworking, and quick to connect with people. When he proposed, I was overjoyed. It wasn't until I visited his parents' house that I found out his father was the company president. It was a surprise, but I didn't marry him for his status. Now, none of it mattered. So promise me, I said, looking directly at them. Don't come back later. begging me not to go through with the divorce. Lois laughed. I won't. You're really going to leave him? Yes, I am, I said firmly, and for the record, I can live my life just fine on my own. But for today, can you please say goodbye to Mom properly? Keith and Lois exchanged smug looks as if they had won. The relatives, watching from the sidelines, frowned at the scene. I'm sorry you all had to see this, I said, turning to the relatives, apologizing for the uncomfortable moment. As I did, Lois leaned in and whispered venomously, always playing the good girl, that's what I hate about you. Her words didn't faze me. I'd put up with so much because she was my sister, but this was the last straw. I wasn't going to consider her family anymore. As for Keith, the decision was final. I was divorcing him. I bit my lower lip hard, bracing myself for the road ahead. I had no family left, but I would rebuild my life, step by step. 2 weeks had passed since the chaos. I packed up everything from the apartment I once shared with Keith and moved into a new condominium closer to the office. I even put my parents' house up for sale. There was nothing tying me to my old life anymore. Meanwhile, Lois moved in with Keith. Our divorce papers had already been finalized and submitted to the courthouse. I imagined they were enjoying their newlywed bliss, completely unaware of what was coming. With Mom's paperwork finally handled, it was time to set my plans in motion. Smiling at her portrait, I thought, watch over me, Mom. The real revenge starts now. The next day, while at the office for my reinstatement, I noticed several voicemail messages piling up on my phone. Hey, what's going on? We're divorced, aren't we? Why do I have to pay $30? 000, Keith's frantic voice echoed in one message. Anticipating they might escalate things and show up at my new home, I agreed to meet them at a nearby diner. Keith arrived fuming, barely able to contain his anger. What is this? He shouted, waving some papers in front of me. I got this from a lawyer. We're already divorced. Do I have to pay? Lois, sitting beside him, looked equally upset. Exactly. What's the meaning of this? I stayed calm and explained. I asked my lawyer to file claims for $40, 000, as my share of the marital assets and $30, 000 from Lois for her part of Mom's medical care. You both should have expected this. Their faces twisted in disbelief. Clearly, they hadn't seen this coming. Keith exploded. That's not fair. You can just demand that kind of money. I crossed my arms and stared him down. Fair? Do you want me to sue for emotional distress too? I've been through hell because of you too. Emotional distress, Keith scoffed. Yes, I said firmly. You cheated, that's a fact, so pay up. They both fell silent, the weight of the legal reality sinking in. After a few moments, Lois dropped her gaze, avoiding my eyes. So, Emily, you're just after the money, huh? Lois sneered. Fine, I'll let Keith pay. If I borrow some money from Dad, we can come up with the $70, 000 easily. I smirked. Keith, you don't even have any savings. Lois, are you sure you're okay being with a guy who's broke? Lois shot back. Keith will be president soon. Then, he'll be rich. I just have to be patient. Oh, Lois, I said with a laugh, you're after the money too, aren't you? No way. I love him, she snapped. Keith chimed in confidently. My dad has always said he'll retire when he turns 65, so in 2 years, I'll be the president. Really, that's quite a claim, I said, barely able to hold back a grin. It would be great if you could actually become president, Keith. I will become president, Keith insisted. I'm the only son. At that, I couldn't hold it in any more, burst out laughing. Lois glared at me. What's wrong with you? Has she finally lost it? She muttered. But this was just the beginning of the real revenge I had planned. Keith, I began. You've been taking a lot of time off work, claiming it was for family reasons, right? Specifically, the funeral. Yeah, he said. My mother-in-law is family too. That's true, I agreed, but the company knows what you've actually been doing. Keith frowned. What do you mean? You didn't know. Your father was kind enough to attend Mom's funeral, I said, my tone dripping with satisfaction. Keith looked shocked. I had deliberately kept Keith and Lois in the dark about his father attending the funeral. Keith had assumed his father knew nothing about what was really going on. I've already informed your companion, your father, about how you lied to get family leave for caregiving, but actually went on vacation to Hawaii with your mistress instead. Keith's face turned pale. That was you. Oh, and let's not forget, I continued, you've also been skipping work for business trips with Lois. I've reported that, too. Keith's voice shook. How did you find out? Lois has been posting photos all over social media, I said with a smirk. Dates, locations, everything. There are even some pictures with you in them. How careless. Lois looked horrified. You've been looking at my social media. It's the same account you used back in high school. Lois, of course, I'd recognize it. Keith turned to Lois, now visibly shaken. Wait, is it true? Does Dad know about all of this? I nodded. Your father saw my mother's family. Naturally, he would attend her funeral, and as president of the company, he had every right to know what his son was really up to. The shock on their faces was priceless. The wheels of justice and revenge were just beginning to turn. Even after the funeral, Keith's father continued to check in on me. I had shared everything that happened with him, including Keith and Lois' betrayal. He was furious. He has no intention of making you the next president, Keith, I said calmly. Keith's face fell. But I'm his son. He said he doesn't remember ever promising that the company would follow hereditary succession. I replied, in fact, he said he doesn't need a son who would act so disloyally. Keith looked completely stunned. Lois' face went pale as I added, oh, and one more thing, starting next month, I'm becoming the president. Both of them stared at me in disbelief. What? That's impossible, Keith shouted. If you think I'm lying, why don't you call your father and ask him yourself? I suggested with a smirk. Keith scrambled to call his father while Lois watched anxiously. When the truth was confirmed, Lois whispered, so Emily is becoming the president. Then, I won't be the president's wife. She turned to Keith, her voice full of regret. If I knew that, I wouldn't have stolen you from Emily. Keith looked betrayed. But you told me you loved me. That included your money, Lois snapped. What did you just say? Keith asked, shocked. I couldn't stand there arguing any longer. I stood up and said, if you want to fight, do it somewhere else. Oh, and don't forget you'll be expecting the payment. As I started to leave, they reached out desperately. Wait, please, don't abandon me, Keith begged. Please support me, sis. I'm sorry, Lois pleaded. I ignored their outstretched hands and walked away. They were no longer my concern. After that, Keith and Lois got divorced. Keith was demoted by his father and eventually quit the company. Now, he works part-time jobs just to pay off the money he owes me. Lois, on the other hand, started working at a bar. She did well for a while but got involved with a con man, which left her in a terrible situation. As for me, I became the president not of the main company, but of a small subsidiary in the caregiving industry. It was based on a proposal I had submitted during my caregiving leave. The business is expected to grow, and I'm determined to make it a success. Though it's a humble start, I'm excited about the future. I'll continue to do my best for myself and for the people who depend on me.